Good afternoon. It's Monday the 17th of June 2019, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me in the studio today, Patrick Henningson from 21st Century Wire. Welcome to the programme, Patrick.
Great to be with you, Mike.
Now, just literally a matter of seconds before we started, Patrick said to me, was this a game show? And well, that, it turns out, is a very interesting question. We're calling this the Tory Leadership Charade, but perhaps not for the reasons that people think. So this was Channel 4, the first debate last night. Well, what was the response? Well, here's James Cleverly. The Channel 4 debate is geared up to encourage Conservative leadership candidates to knock chunks out of each other. That's not how this campaign should be conducted. It's probably good for Channel 4's viewing figures, but I'm astonished that so many candidates are playing along. Well, the question is, why might they be playing along? Now, Boris wasn't there, of course. And I wonder why that was. Well, his campaign is being run by this person, Sir Lynton Crosby. So Boris being advised by Sir Lynton Crosby on the leadership race. This is from a few weeks ago. I think it's the middle of May or so, this particular Telegraph article. As Minister warns, it's not a reality TV contest. But in fact, is it not a reality TV contest? We're suggesting that if we had spoken to Lynton Crosby today, he would be saying it is a reality TV contest. Well, who is he anyway? We'll come on to that in a moment, but we have a bit of a UK column exclusive here, because we have been told by a senior source inside Parliament that Lynton Crosby is in fact running the whole shebang. He is running not just Boris Johnson's campaign, but all the campaigns of all the leadership candidates, and therefore had a very big hand in what happened on Channel 4 News last night, or on Channel 4 last night. So this is a reliable source. This is not yet confirmed, because although we've contacted Conservative Party headquarters to get a comment from them, we haven't had a response on that just yet. But what this demonstrates, assuming it's true, is that what we're seeing is pure theatre and nothing. Now, as I say, most of our viewers and listeners will probably view this as theatre in any case, but perhaps not for this reason. So if, as I say, if Lynton Crosby is behind every candidate, then there are some questions to be asked. Now, just to put this man into perspective, this is the Telegraph, this is the Guardian from 2017, just after the Tory, or around the time of the general election. Lynton Crosby isn't a genius, and 5 other lessons the election taught us. So he ran the Tory party election at the time, and that worked out well, didn't it? Well, of course it did work out well if the policy behind everything is that you scupper Brexit. It worked out very well under those circumstances. So he was in charge of that campaign, and that was the result. Now, this is his company, CT Group. When you give advice, seek to help, not to please. This is a quote from Solon the Wise, apparently. They're using him as their sort of figurehead here. But what's interesting, if you look through the website, you get a very clear understanding that this person and this organisation that he runs are right at the heart of government. So they're handling government relations with private corporations, between private corporations and government, for example. What experience do they have managing civil servants, maybe? Or are they working very closely with civil servants? So we're not just necessarily talking about working with political campaigns, but possibly relationships between private corporations and government, and therefore they come into contact with civil service and so on. So what's the relationship between Lynton Crosby and Mark Sedwill? This is a question that we need to think about. Perhaps it puts a little bit of perspective on this, because let's just listen to a bit of commentary from LBC yesterday.
Talkie, David, good morning to you.
Very good morning to you, Nigel and Rory.
Good morning to you.
Excellent. Last time I think we spoke, Rory, you were in chairing Defence Committee. I've got a question for you, and that's along the lines of what your colleague Steve Baker has been talking about, that we don't just have a problem with the leadership being Remain and the majority of MPs being Remain, which is going against the democratic mandate of just to leave and get on with it, as you say. But we also have another problem, that the Cabinet Office is set and tasked to get us into the EU, not out. So what I want to know is, Rory, are you prepared to go into the Cabinet Office and retask it to get us out?
Yes, 100%.
Well, the question is that a reasonable thing for Rory Stewart to claim, that he is going to 100% get into the Cabinet Office and retask it? Because frankly, the only way that he could possibly retask the Cabinet Office would be to shift Mark Sedwill and Ollie Robbins and people like that out of the way and replace them with people that are willing to actually follow the democratic mandate which was given by the British people in 2016. So, but again, we have possible connections between Lynton Crosby and the Cabinet Office. We don't know what those are. We're asking the questions today because this is very important. If the entire leadership campaign is a charade, a bit of theatre, if it's a pre-done deal, well, there's policy behind this, and whoever ends up being the leader of the Tory party is going to be pursuing that policy. Has there been a change of policy since Theresa May has stepped down? I don't think so. So in the meantime, we've got the likes of this going on in the Telegraph today. Brussels nicknamed Dominic Raab the Turnip during his disastrous spell as Brexit Secretary. Where did this article come from? Did this come from Crosby? Did it come from his organisation as part of this charade that we're watching, where we've got an article placed in the Telegraph making the point that the Europeans have been making fun of Dominic Raab because his name in Dutch happens to be similar to the word for turnip in Dutch. So questions to ask then. What is Lynton Crosby's role in this leadership contest? Is this anything more than reality TV? I would suggest it's not. If the Tory party is not able to take their leadership contest seriously, what hope is there for Brexit? And the other question I would ask is, what is the underlying policy which is driving this charade? And I'm suggesting that it is in fact a policy to remain within the European Union. Patrick, this to me is a subversion of the democratic process, because you're supposed to be choosing a leader in a democratic way. But this looks increasingly like a complete setup.
The first thing I'm going to comment quickly on, Mike, is that whole Channel 4 debate scene. This is the Americanization of British politics. This is, and we said many times on the radio show, The Sunday Wire, I always said that politics is the new Hollywood. Politics is the new Hollywood. So political figures are the new celebrities. And this is a global political entertainment complex. And these things are happening on social media, and people are having their sort of favorite and their characters and so forth. That's the first thing I'm going to say, Mike. And so that's the dumbing down of politics. That's the commercialization, the entertainmentization of politics. So secondly, the fact that Boris Johnson, the front runner, is not even included in a debate for the Tory leadership contest. This guy's supposed to be prime minister. He's the odds-on favorite right now. You put 80 down to win 10 on Boris. He's absolutely the odds-on favorite. Why is he not in the debate? Whether it's a joke or not, according to the Boris Johnson camp, doesn't matter. What can the public possibly glean from a debate without the front runner there, supposedly, right? So that's another thing. The other thing is, I'm going to say Rory Stewart made the comment that he will absolutely retask the Cabinet Office to get on with the business of Brexit. But to do that, Mikey's going to have to basically reverse Tony Blair's civil service revolution.
Absolutely.
And reverse the whole way that government's been running for the better part of the last 20 years. In other words, to change it from the power being taken away from the Cabinet Office and given back to the ministerial departments, where they're then tasking the Cabinet Office. There won't be no tasking of the Cabinet Office till you reverse the way that the system has been redesigned, beginning under Tony Blair. That's another point I wanted to make.
Absolutely. Now, just to finish on the question of why Boris wasn't there, if the purpose of last night's debate, as it seems to be, was to see the second-tier candidates ripping chunks off each other, as we said, clearly, if you wouldn't want your front runner to be taking part in that style of debate. So he's made the excuse that he would prefer to only take part in the BBC version of the debate, which is not going to have Christian Guru Murthy asking the questions or setting the scene, and is perhaps going to be much more to Boris's liking.
So this is about building the profile of candidates, maybe so that they can achieve sort of higher cabinet positions, perhaps, or for their own political careers. So it's kind of a power sharing arrangement, Mike, within the Tory party. They're using this opportunity to springboard certain personalities, like a Rory Stewart, for instance, like a Jeremy Hunt, so they can get into a higher position and maybe sort of angle their way to Prime Minister in the next election, possibly. That's what it looks like to me. And
just a final comment on Rory Stewart. Of course, he is the up-and-coming second place man at the moment, ahead of Jeremy Hunt. But we should keep in mind that despite what he said on LBC about retasking the Cabinet Office, he is the favourite of Kenneth Clarke, who's probably the biggest Europhile in the entire Conservative Party and possibly in the whole House of Commons. So if Kenneth Clarke is keen to see Rory Stewart as the leader, the future leader of the Tory party, I think we should be asking questions about why he would want that particular individual as the leader.
And that brings up major concerns about Brexit, or at least a hard Brexit, as it were.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, now, quick reminder that on Wednesday this week in the George in Plimpton, where David Ellis and I are giving a quick briefing on how to use Twitter for activism purposes, a demonstration. We're asking people to bring your mobile phones or a tablet or something along. There will be a wireless connection there if you want to bring a tablet that doesn't have 4G connection. And we'll be asking people to take part, and that should be quite an interesting evening. And if you'd like to support the work that the UK Column does, then please get across to ukcolumn.org/community, where you can take out a membership there. And just a brief reminder that AV10 DVDs are available from the UK Column. They're also available from 21st Century Wire. So if you want to support Ian Crane's work, then please pick up a box set there. Now, Patrick, on Friday, then you were at the extradition hearing for Julian Assange.
Yes, indeed. So this has been moved around, this hearing. This is the sort of opening of the process of extraditing Julian Assange to the United States. So this was moved originally to Belmarsh Prison's courthouse because of the ill health of Assange, but then it was moved back to Westminster Magistrates Court. It's a very small courtroom, number 3. I was able to get in, along with a handful of other journalists, to report on those proceedings, Mike. And that's just the beginning of the process. And what we learned, the important thing that we learned from this was that, and by the way, Assange appeared via video link. So we were able to see that he was in slightly better health than he'd been depicted in a video that was leaked a couple of weeks ago, of showing his physical condition to be very thin, very pale. He seemed to have put on a bit more weight, and was definitely mentally, his faculties were there, although he seemed very stressed. And part of that probably had to do, Mike, with the proceedings being so constrained and him being remote and away from his legal team and having his life being decided by a bunch of people in suits somewhere in Westminster. But it was definitely a fascinating thing to see the so-called justice system at work, which clearly appears to be rigged completely against Assange in this case. So his legal team is asking for more time, any time that they could get extra time to prepare for what is clearly a complex case. They have limited access to their client, as he does to his defense. He remarked that he had to have documents posted to him, and he had not even been able to read the US 17 superseding indictments, or even a summary of them, per se. I'm not sure about that, but hadn't read the actual documents. And the court said, well, we just received them yesterday from the United States. So, but nonetheless, the Home Secretary has signed the extradition warrant for last week. So the government has already put its cards on the table, Mike. They're not going to stand in the way of the court should the court decide that Assange should be extradited to the United States. So they've already staked their position. And it looks like there's going to be a 5-day hearing, Mike, at the end of February, so February 24th or 25th. And that's going to actually bring this into early March of 2020. Okay.
Was there any indication as to why that should be so far in the future?
I think just because of the time it takes to prepare this case and the schedules they have with the courts.
Surely they've had several years while he's been in the Ecuadorian embassy to get prepared for it?
Well, not quite, because they didn't quite know how this was going to sort of play out in terms of what charges are going to be put against Assange and so forth. So, I mean, from the defense's point of view, they would need a year to prepare for this case, especially if you can't see your client regularly. Okay. So, but so Assange will be eligible for early release for serving his custodial sentence. He's also lodged an appeal for the bail skipping charge. Whether he gets that successfully or not and gets early release, but he still won't be released in the public, probably because as soon as he's done serving his time for bail skipping, Mike, there will be a U.S. extradition warrant which will be placed on his shoulders, holding him down, maybe in a lesser security facility, not Belmarsh, not a Supermax facility. But and if that's the case, he would have more time with his legal team. So that would be good for in terms of his defense. He's actually a vital part of his own defense because of the technical nature of these charges. Julian Assange is a major asset to his legal team. No matter how many great lawyers you can assemble, he's actually probably the most important asset to his own defense, arguably. So the state has worked very well with the prison system and the judiciary to limit access to Assange, and that's what we call justice and due process. So, but we'll keep you up to date on this. The key dates will be coming up. There's another hearing on July 31st, but also the case management hearing is going to be October 21st in the fall. So that's when things are going to probably get interesting. We'll be able to see what the next 10 weeks are actually going to look like. And of course, there's more and more people getting involved in this issue, Mike. More and more people. We met people from all over the world who were there last week, who traveled from long distances to support this WikiLeaks and Assange. They do see how important this is in terms of the free press, freedom of speech going forward. But not just that, is the U.S. going to be allowed to exert universal jurisdiction globally over any journalist, non-American or any non-American publication, and be able to sort of grab people from anywhere in the world and bring them back to the United States and put them in front of a court on trumped up charges. That's actually another part of this case that's really important.
Absolutely.
So,
okay, well, let's move to Russia, or at least Western attacks on Russia, could we call them? But here's the BBC. UK Special Forces set for new Russia mission. This is by Mark Urban. Now, Mark Urban, the diplomatic and defense editor for Newsnight, of course, published a book last year on Skripal. And, well, he managed to get an interview with Mr. Skripal 3 months or so before he was poisoned, allegedly.
Fancy that.
Yes. So Mark Urban, very close connections to the intelligence services, and particularly the intelligence agency circles that were around Skripal at the time. So perhaps these are the same people that were in fact involved with the Russiagate issue in the United States. Christopher Steele and so on, Pablo Miller and whatnot. But anyway, he's published this article on the BBC at the end of last week. UK Special Forces set for new Russia mission. And so what they're saying is basically because the war on terror is winding down, Special Forces made up, this is the Special Air Service, the Special Boat Service, Special Reconnaissance Regiment, are to be turned on Russia under a plan that's being called Special Operations Concept. So basically, they will be working very, very closely with the intelligence agencies, particularly MI6, is what Urban was releasing. Now, this comes at the same time that this gentleman, General Sir Mark Carlton Smith, who's the Chief of the General Staff, was making some comments with respect to Russia at RUSI last week. He said, peace and war are two increasingly redundant states. That is a fascinating statement.
Very Orwellian.
That's
so what do you translate that quickly, Mike? That's just continuous, what they call low-intensity conflict over indefinite period of time, or high-intensity conflict spread out over large areas?
Well, he was particularly hinting about Russia. He said authoritarian regimes are exploiting the hybrid space that exists between and that would be disinformation, subversion, cyber attacks, and so on. So he's angling at Russia for this. But as we'll see in a second, or as we've just seen from Mark Urban, actually Britain is angling to do exactly that to Russia. and as we'll see in a second, the United States seems to be doing that to Russia as well. Now, the Russians themselves had some comments on this exposure by Mark Urban. They said, of course, it's hard for us to say how reliable this information is and how it corresponds with real tasks of the UK Armed Forces. However, if it's true, this decision appears to be firstly erroneous and secondly questionable as far as London's compliance with its international obligations are concerned. In fact, this would mean that this would mean that UK defence agencies are paving the way for removing the existing restrictions imposed by international law and to claim the right to carry out military operations beyond the limits of self-defence, which constitutes a direct breach of the UN Charter. This would not just become yet another step towards deliberately destroying the world order based on international law, but also create major risks of those hybrid operations evolving into full-fledged armed conflicts as a result of various coincidences and misunderstandings. I think that's a very fair statement by Russia, and so far now we've got allegations from the Western side that Russia is carrying out hybrid warfare, disinformation warfare against the West, and yet we have definitive evidence that the West is doing this to Russia, but that's all right.
Double standards.
Absolutely.
As usual.
So where does that take us? Well, it takes us to another alleged attack against Russia and Mr. Bolton claiming to be carrying this out.
Well, this is a fascinating story that drifted out by the New York Times just over the weekend. The U.S. escalates online attacks on Russia's power grid. Now, that's going to set off alarms, and understandably so, with so many people. And of course, one of the front and center characters in this story, of course, is President Donald Trump, but not in the way that you might expect. Actually, this article is basically saying that these new cyber offensive operations are underway, but the president isn't necessarily being briefed about them. This is one of the cruxes of this article. And they're calling this the daily digital Cold War. So you can see how this is being framed, Mike. There's a new Cold War. It's digital and it's daily. So it is not ongoing, basically.
Okay, but let's deconstruct this a little bit. The Cold War, it was a Cold War. It was not a hot war. We weren't actually attacking each other. People were, the Russians, the West, we were building up arms and armaments to offset each other's capability, but we were never actually attacking each other. This almost implies, this is trying to put the idea in people's minds that if you deploy an offensive Trojan or some form of electronic warfare on another country, that is a Cold War, that you haven't actually attacked them. That's a pretty dangerous position.
Well, the U.S. has now changed the law and the language in their own engagement in terms of government policy that cyber operations are on equal footing with air and sea military operations. So any cyber threat is deemed to be equal threat to, in terms of national security, to sea and air. Likewise, in terms of the Pentagon's remit and the classifications and so forth, goes along the same line as well. So in this case, and I'll show you what we've unearthed here with this story, which is incredibly interesting. So here's the key quote I just want to put out on the table right at the beginning. It says, "The critical question, which is impossible to know without access to classified details." As you see, Mike, I've highlighted that part, details of this operation. So basically, the New York Times is saying, we have secret sources and we have to take their word for it, but at the end of the day, it's impossible to know without access to classified details of the operation, which we'll get to what we think about this towards the end. So, and now they go on to say, is how deep into the Russian grid the United States has actually bored. Okay, how deep have they gone into the Russian grid with their new cyber tools? Only then will it be clear whether it would be possible to plunge Russia onto darkness or cripple its military, a question that that may not be answerable until the code is activated. Sounds all very James Bondish, doesn't it, Mike? But is it true? How much of this is true? How much of this is media pap, basically? And we question all aspects of this story, actually. But then moving on swiftly, cyber offense, this is the category. Now, what the New York Times is saying, now this is interesting, this part's real. Presidential Memoranda 13 the ability to conduct offensive online operations without receiving presidential approval. Guess who it was signed by? Donald Trump. He signed his own
Death
waiver.
warrant here.
Yeah, he signed his own waivers. The president, big tough patriot military man, giving away all his power to the deep state, just as he promised in his campaign that he wouldn't do. So Presidential Memoranda 13. Now here's the interesting part, Mike. This is also enshrined in the new John McCain, they've renamed it from the John Warner, sorry, Defense Authorization Act. It's now the John McCain Defense Authorization Act for the fiscal year of 2019, authorized by the Defense Secretary to conduct ongoing and daily offensive cyber operations, again, without any executive approval. So this is now law in the United States. And whether this story might appear fictional or propaganda, or it could be political brinksmanship to sort of make Trump look bad, which the New York Times is clearly trying to do on a daily basis. Still, Mike, it is a little bit disturbing that the media isn't questioning these powers, and in terms of the balance of powers, the checks and balances in Washington, they're not doing any of that. But we'll go back and say the president should be worried about this, but then again, he signed away his power there. So on to the enemy of the people. So this was Trump's reaction. He said, do you believe that the failing New York Times did a story stating that the United States is substantially increasing cyber attacks on Russia? This is a virtual act of treason by the New York Times, by a once great paper so desperate for a story, any story, even if it's bad for the country. So that's quite a reaction by the president against this. So he's saying this is absolutely not true. And then he follows this up with, also not true, anything goes with our corrupt news media today. They will do or say whatever it takes with not even the slightest thought of consequence. These are true cowards and without a doubt, the enemy of the people. And that's the term, Mike, that really gets the goat of the mainstream media. Jim Acosta's got a new book out. He's a CNN reporter. The new book's called Enemy of the People. And everyone's decrying the president for saying that the corporate mainstream media, the enemy of the people, and they're saying this is an attack on the press. And yes, I see where people are coming from there, but actually, in this case, and in the case of Russiagate for the last 3 years, the corporate media actually are the enemy of the people. That's the point. But I think a lot of people on the political left are looking for an easy attack vector to the president and conflating this with the WikiLeaks Assange story and 17 indictments against Assange, which is an attack on the press. Absolutely. And that is coming from the administration. But when Donald Trump says the press are the enemy of the people, he hasn't specifically attributed that to WikiLeaks. He's really talking about the Washington Post, the New York Times, CNN, MSNBC, CBS, etc., the rest of the alphabet soup.
Well, it seems to me that if the role of the media has changed from being the eyes and ears of the people and questioning the actions of government, if they've changed from being that to instead being the eyes and ears of the government and providing the government with a platform to look at comments that are left under articles, or providing the government with a channel to bombard the people with propaganda, or that are attacking the people on social media who are questioning the government narrative, then corporate media has become the enemy of the people.
I think what Donald Trump's trying to say is something that I've said before, which is that the mainstream media, the corporate mainstream media, are the fourth estate, as it's once known, the fourth estate has become a fifth column, working against the interests of the public. And I think that's probably, if the president was able to articulate that better, that's probably a good way to articulate, hopefully. You're welcome to steal that from us, Donald, if you're watching this broadcast. But just moving on, Mike, I want to remind people here, this is really important, okay? What we're talking about here might be, stretching the truth in terms of the New York Times' story here with some political bent behind it. But this is from 2013. Russian nuclear power plant was infected by the Stuxnet virus that was meant to target the Iranian nuclear facilities. A lot of people miss this story. This was reported in 2013. And who was the source for this? Well, it was none other than Eugene Kaspersky. He's a cybersecurity expert and the founder of Kaspersky Labs. This is what he said. Criticizing government departments responsible for engineering cyber attacks, Kaspersky said, they don't understand that in cyberspace, everything you do, it's a boomerang. It will come back to you. He said that in 2013. The Stuxnet was deployed in 2010. This was under the Obama administration. It wasn't because, if not for whistleblowers like General James Cartwright, that we wouldn't know the full extent maybe of this program. But Mike, the important thing here is what you said also last night on the Sunday Wire, which Bill Binney said in your former NSA technical director said that once that code is sent out, it can be captured and rejigged and then sent back in a different form. So, and not only that, Volt 7 showed us that they used a lot of this this code they put out there in public. It was open source, or it was stuff that was just, you know, they used off the shelf sort of stuff, and a lot of that had to do with, I don't know what the reason, that it might have been licensing actually or something. I'm not sure what the deal was with Vault 7, but a lot of stuff floating around in cyberspace, dangerous malware, and stuff that actually the CIA had put out
in the first place.
In the first place, so hugely dangerous. So we have to ask the question, Mike. This is what our governments are spending billions and billions and billions of pounds and dollars on, is creating all these sort of malicious tools for what and to what end? That's the question. So we'll have a quick look here at the HR 5515. This is the John Sidney McCain National Defense Authorization Act of the fiscal year of 2019. And all I can say, Mike, is that even in the afterlife or not, this man is still haunting us here. Saint John McCain, who recently been canonized by the first church of Raytheon, has made him a saint in his in memoriam. So what's going on in terms of that? And then you have to add this here, that this is, you have to look at the New York Times article, Mike, and the fact that they're sourcing this. A lot of this is coming from the new John McCain laws. That constantly this president is being trolled by John McCain, even in the afterlife. We're calling this trolling immemorial. And so this is McCain supporters saying that there should be a John McCain Day on his on his birthday, declaring it John McCain Day. So it's endless, the amount of trolling with this president. So where was this reporting coming from? One of the main sources for this New York Times story was John Bolton, arch neocon. And this was an event which was sponsored by the Wall Street Journal, Mike. So let's look at what's going on here in reality. Right now in the newspapers, Mike, you've seen the reports, John Bolton's on the outs. He might be sacked any day now. You've probably seen this in a lot of different media outlets. So this is Rupert Murdoch. He is definitely bolstering his friend John Bolton here. And who is backing Bolton? People like Sheldon Adelson. And John Bolton has definitely strong alliances to Israel, but also very strong anti-Iranian sentiments as well. And so right now, that is the #1 target for the U.S., for Israel, for Rupert Murdoch, for the war machine, as it were. And Donald Trump has been accused of getting cold feet on Iran. And so he's talking about, we want to eventually have come back to the table with the Iranian government and so forth. We don't want a war. This isn't exactly what John Bolton wants. So you can see who's elevating Bolton here and why. And we have Rupert Murdoch, and certainly behind the scenes, no doubt, people like Sheldon Adelson. These are the real powerful billionaires, the oligarchs behind the throne in the United States, and quite frankly responsible for Trump, part of his success as well. So, and half his cabinet, by the way. So is it going to be a Cold War? Is it going to be a hot war? Certainly with Iran, we're seeing a lot of noises towards a hot war. And so this leaves us with the last question, Mike. This was the original story we started with. U.S. escalates online attacks on a Russian power grid. Is it real?
Or is it fake?
Is it fake news? I think it's fake news. There's nothing in this story of any substance, and the Russians certainly aren't coming out with anything in specifically. It just seems unbelievable once again. So,
well, let's move to the EU then. And today is the Foreign Affairs Council. And Federica Mogherini, of course, is heading that up as the High Representative for Foreign Affairs. Let's have a listen to what she had to say.
Today we'll have an agenda focused mainly on the implementation of our global strategy. We will have the foreign and the defense ministers of the 28 joining together. It sounds very theoretical, but it is indeed the work we've done on the European Union defense, the work that still needs to be done, but also our support to multilateralism, to the UN system, to the global agenda, and the way in which we work as a union on global affairs, and how we can be even more a point of reference in the world.
So first thing you'll notice, this is an EU 28 meeting, not an EU 27 meeting, so the UK is involved in this. One of the UK representatives that's there today is Harriet Baldwin, who works, of course, for the Department for International Development. Well, this is what her comments were when she arrived this morning.
Hi, how are you? Good to see you.
Yes.
What brings you here today? What will you be discussing?
Well, I'm here for the Foreign Affairs Council, and my priority today is to talk about Sudan, where I think we need to show international cohesion in terms of sending the message to back up what the African Union is doing and calling for peaceful transition to a civilian government in Sudan.
I mean, the issue that's in the headlines is Iran and what happened with those oil tankers. Does the British government have any of its own information about what really happened?
Yes, we do now. Over the weekend, we've been able to come up to the conclusion that we are almost certain that this was Iranian action. And so we stand ready to ensure that this key international waterway remains open to international shipping.
Are you going to be discussing that today?
I believe it's coming up over lunch, that's right, yeah. Okay.
Thanks very much.
Yes, over lunch. We'll come on to Iran in a second. So she mentioned Sudan there. Of course, Sudan suffering badly with war and so on, and the military have taken over the government there. The EU is very keen to see a civilian government back in place in Sudan. But Sudan, one of the Sahel countries, very central to EU policy at the moment, and particularly is being used as justification to pursue an EU defence policy, an EU defence union. So the Common Foreign and Security Policy is absolutely part of the agenda for the Foreign Affairs Council meeting today, and Britain absolutely taking part in that. But if you speak to any of the leadership candidates, defence is not something they want to discuss.
quick comment on Sudan, Mike. I think this is one of the most underreported stories right now, right across the press. A lot of people aren't aware. There's absolute massacres going on in Sudan, hundreds of people being killed. I want to point out, Mike, that Sudan has played a pivotal role under the previous so-called brutal dictator who has supplied the majority of ground forces for Saudi Arabia in its illegal war against Yemen. And that's a kind of a deal between Saudi Arabia and Sudan, but not just between Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia's allies as well, which include the United States and the United Kingdom, okay? And they're very aware that Sudan's been supplying the sort of, doing the heavy lifting on the ground throughout the Yemeni war, because Saudi doesn't have many ground troops at all. It's practically, the whole military is practically a mercenary operation drawn from different countries. So Sudan has played an absolutely key role in that. Now, I think that there has also been a rebellion. Reports I have heard that there are members of the military who are not on board with this anymore. And so it's funny that although a military government isn't the ideal situation, Mike, it's not an absolutely black and white situation there.
No, no, indeed. And we've got to keep in mind that these countries, which are destabilized around the southern end of the Sahara and so on, these countries are in receipt of lots of UK aid, something that Harriet Baldwin is partly responsible for delivering. It never ceases to fascinate me, Patrick, that everywhere you see UK aid and US aid going into, the result is destabilization, conflict, insurgency, the likes of Islamic insurgency appearing in those countries. and who's the main driver of Islamic insurgency? Ultimately, well, Saudi Arabia has got a lot of responsibility, bears a lot of responsibility for that, because it's quite often their money which is being used to drive it, as well as our own. So, and we must remember that the issue of these countries south of the Sahara is the key justification for pursuing defence union policy within the European Union. So Britain absolutely on board with that, but it is not discussed as part of Brexit, and it's not discussed as part of these leadership debates. But in the meantime, she also mentioned Iran, and they're apparently discussing that over lunch today. In amazing timing, Patrick, with respect to what happened at the end of last week. Also at the end of last week, or on Saturday, the husband of Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, who's the former journalist or employee of the Thomson Reuters Foundation, who's currently in prison in Iran. Her husband has set up a tent outside the Iranian embassy. And the headline here from CNN is Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe's husband goes on hunger strike outside the Iranian embassy in London. And this is basically because she has decided to go on hunger strike in prison in Iran. So he said that he had received a phone call from her to tell him that she'd informed the Iranian judiciary that she'd stopped taking food and protested her unfair imprisonment. So he's not going to eat either for the duration of her protest. But this is all putting pressure on Iran, of course. But the question remains, what was Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe doing? We don't know. She was found guilty of spying by the Iranians, and that's what she's in prison for. Of course, she had previously worked for BBC Media Action, and we've got to remember what they were doing in Syria in 2004. So this is Juliet Harkin, formerly from BBC Media Action. BBC Media Action, worked in 2004 with individuals within the ministry, the Syrian ministry, who wanted change and tried to get them to be drivers of that. And she went on to say, all media development work that has been done in Syria has, in my opinion, been predicated upon the idea that it can be changed from within. You have an authoritarian regime and you find who the reformers are within that and you work with them. Now, Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe had been working with BBC Media Action as project manager, subsequently working with the Thomson Reuters Foundation in a similar role. These two organisations carry out the same types of work in the sense that they are training journalists in the Western mould to be reporting from or within these countries. And the first question in my mind, Patrick, is what business has the likes of BBC Media Action or Thomson Reuters Foundation to go into countries to train journalists there in the Western mould? And it's effectively pursuing a soft power policy through journalism, is it not?
And people were allowed to, I think, governments could get away with this for a number of years, Mike, because people just didn't, maybe the press or the international press or even politicians in these target nations weren't sort of au fait with the sort of the NGO agenda, basically. But now it's becoming more clear after seeing like the Ukraine, or also seeing the exploits of the Open Society Foundation, NGOs, but also USAID, the National Endowment for Democracy, and so forth and so on. And in Syria, these media NGOs have had a massive impact. And after BBC Media Action, then you have a whole plethora of organizations that have been used to sort of destabilize media organizations, funded by the French, partly by French ministry, but also getting money from the UK, from the US, for many of these operations to destabilize Syria from within and to promote the so-called rebel cause, or if you will, since late 2011 till now even. So this is a very real situation, it's a very real problem, and a lot of countries are becoming wise to it and also kicking these NGOs out. Egypt has done this, a number of other countries have done it as well. So Russia has also done this as well. So Iran is, going to be concerned about its security. It's going to be concerned about a color revolution fomented by the likes of the United States government, like the British, like the French, or any of the NATO states as well. So, and not only that, the Gulf states too, Mike, they're involved in this soft power subterfuge as well. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, putting a lot of money and resources behind this too.
So just to bring the programme full circle then and back to a leadership candidate, here's Boris and ITV News here reporting that Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe's husband says that he resented Boris Johnson. Now, this is all about while Boris had been Foreign Secretary, and while he was Foreign Secretary, he had been giving evidence to the Select Committee, so Mr. Ratcliffe here saying he clearly made a mistake and clearly tried to correct it, and made a promise that he wasn't able to deliver on. At times, I've resented him for it. And there are bits that I did resent him for, because what Boris had said was that she had been training journalists. And of course, that was a big mistake, because that's effectively what the Iranian government had said that she was doing. And that was why they had convicted her of, well, they called it spying, but of course, it was really, the charges were really related to what they described as undermining the state. Boris unfortunately misspoke in the sense that perhaps he said too much at that particular defense.
But the timing of this coming out now, with the husband's protest, Mike, and the Conservative leadership elections happening now,
right?
Could this be a wedge issue that could sink sometimes these black swans happen in electoral contests. It's not a real election, of course. It's an internal Tory election for Prime Minister, but it does play out in the media, Mike, and public opinion does influence a little bit, I think, what the result's going to be. Could this sink Boris Johnson's leadership bid if the media really went for it and hung it all on Boris? Because he could be blamed, at least in the press, for basically implicating Zaghari-Ratcliffe through his bumbling comments, as it were, or whatever, when he was foreign minister.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think the opposition that there is within the Tory party to Boris Johnson is based on the fact that he opens his mouth and says too much too often, and this was a perfect example of it. And whether she was genuinely involved in some kind of subversive activity or not, I don't know, because I don't know exactly what her role was in the Thomson Reuters Foundation. But the point is that those organizations are carrying out those types of operations in those kinds of countries. That doesn't change the fact that he should not have said what he said, because it has had a direct impact on her freedom.
So he's opened his big mouth.
Absolutely.
And trouble follows, so that's another issue.
Okay, well look, we're going to have to leave it there because we're right out of time. So thank you very much for joining us today. Patrick, thank you for joining us. We will be back at the same time at 1 p.m. on Wednesday. We hope to see you then. Bye-bye.